I'm going to talk about these transmissions again. The last video was about things that changed during their production, but now I want to talk about something that I think is a problem and how to deal with it. This is an old side plate from a transmission. I probably won't use this one because the axle tube's been repaired, so I'll use it to demonstrate. First, I need to get this old bearing out. This is a puller I made. I showed it in some of those older videos when I was rebuilding a transmission like this. These fingers have a little lip on the bottom to catch under the bearing race. And as long as the bearing has a small gap behind it, I can get a hold of it. This bearing don't have a gap behind it. It's pressed all the way to the bottom of the hole, so I have to do something else first. I have this ground rod that's the same size as the shaft that fits in there, and I'm going to bump it in there with a dead blow hammer. First, I'll bump the shaft back and forth with my hand. And I'll waller it back and forth while I pull upward. Either the shaft will come out or the bearing will come out. Alright, the shaft came out. That raised the bearing up far enough the puller jaws will get under it. I put the jaws in there so the lip's under the bearing, and the stack of feeler gauges keeps the jaws apart so they're locked in there. Pulling bearings is not the point of this video, but I'll show how it works since I have to get this old bearing out. Yeah, there's a lot of crud in there. I want to measure this bearing bore here. This is a telescoping gauge. These probes on the end are spring loaded, and there's a knob on the end of the handle that locks the probes in place. I want to measure this ring where it's welded to the side plate, so I set the gauge at an angle just inside the bore, feeling for the widest spot. Tighten the knob on the handle, and then rock the gauge so those probes are forced through the bore. The probes get forced inward as they go through there, but since the knob's tight, they stay at the position they were forced to. Then you can measure that with a micrometer. Go through the process twice and make sure you get the same reading. And this says 1 inch and 637 thousandths. Now I'm going to measure the bore where there's no weld holding it down, and that'll be a different reading. Measure it twice to make sure. And this one says 1 inch and 618 thousandths. This bearing measures 1 inch and 625 thousandths, which is 1 inch and 5/8. Ideally, this bearing bore should be round and 1/2 to 1/1000th of an inch smaller than the bearing. At the narrow part, it's 7 thousandths undersize, and at the widest part, it's 12 thousandths oversize. When the weld cools, it shrinks and pulls that ring into an oval shape. That means this bearing bore is 19 thousandths of an inch out of round. To give you an idea of what that is, I'll set this telescoping gauge to the narrow part of the bore, and here you can see how much it rattles around in there when I turn it the other way. Also, from this camera angle, you can see the clean spot where the bearing was touching the bore. Everywhere else around the bore is dirty because it wasn't touching the bearing. This is a good used bearing. I'm going to press it into this hole and see how it works. I just pressed it in so the top is flush so I can get it back out easier. But you can see that with the bearing installed, it don't spin very easy. I can turn it if I grab the inner race, but it don't spin freely. This is not the gear that goes in this position, but it's got the right size shaft. With this amount of weight on there, it should spin easier. This turns okay, and it would probably work. That's a used bearing, so it's going to have more clearance from being worn. I'm going to put a new bearing in here and see if there's a difference. This one has more balls in it, probably just because it's a different brand name. Now with this one in there, I can't turn it easily. As expected, this one turns a little harder than the used bearing. If I put this big gear on there and turn it, it comes to a stop pretty quickly. I don't like that. This was a free turning bearing when it went in there, and now it's squashed into an oval. Not really what you want to do to your new bearings. I'm going to use this hand grinder with a straight-sided wheel that's flat on the end. I need to widen out this bearing race a little so it don't pinch the bearing. Well, that was a mistake. I'm grinding in the wrong place. I want to grind where it's not welded. That's the narrow part. You need to grind a little bit and then measure it to see how much you took off. This time it measures about 1 inch and 622, so I'm going to go just a little bit more. Now it measures 1 inch and 623, and that's close enough. The bearing's 1 inch and 625, and the bore is 1 inch and 623, so there's 2 thousandths interference there. More than you'd want if you're pressing into something that don't flex, but in this case the ring will stretch out when the bearing goes in, so the ring should have a good grip on the outer bearing race. I'll clean this out good so I don't get the new bearing dirty. And I'll go press the new bearing in there again. That feels better, but you probably can't tell on camera. So let's put this big gear in there and see what happens. Now look how that drops in there. You realize what that means. That undersized bore was squashing the outer race. The force was transferred through the balls, and the balls were actually squashing the inner race into an oval. Your bearing just works better when everything's round. You want to see your gear spin for a while. There's 2 bearing bores on each side plate that needs checked for that. Your rule of thumb is, if it's been welded on, it might be distorted. Well, I don't know if anybody else fixes the problem that way. But that's what I came up with, hanging out here doing my own thing. Alright, that's it.